Thank you for downloading this podcast from the British Theatre Guide. For more information about British Theatre Guide, please visit britishtheatreguide.info. The Honest Actors podcast was founded by Belfast-born actor Jonathan Harden in 2015 and is currently launching its third and final series, featuring long, frank discussions with experienced actors about the joys and torments of their chosen career. As he was in the midst of launching new episodes in the days leading up to Christmas, I turned the tables on Jonathan, asking about his life and career as an actor, as well as what he has learned from the last 3 years of interviews with other actors. But first, I asked him to explain a bit about the aims and origins of the Honest Actors podcast.
The Honest Actors podcast is a show that I started in 2015, what seems like a lifetime ago, because at that point, I'm not sure this is still true. In fact, I know it's not. But at that point, there was a dearth of podcasts aimed at actors or certainly discussing the kind of things that I now discuss in Honest Actors. It's really interesting just watching how podcasts have evolved, because when I started doing it, it feels like there are now 10 times more podcasts and it's much more competitive. And it's a great thing because, as a friend of mine used to say, a high tide raises all boats, and more people listening to podcasts is a great thing. But when I started it, it felt very much like it was after the winter of Serial first series, which in podcasting terms was a huge moment. And it's how I discovered podcasts, and all of a sudden realised that there wasn't something out there, certainly not something British, hosted by an actor talking about, not about acting, but talking to other actors about whatever took their fancy. And I started it, and we're now just kicking off season 3, or series 3, I should say. And we're about 28 episodes in. So it's not a huge volume in terms of numbers. It's not a huge volume of episodes, but I made a decision very early on that I wasn't going to make it a weekly burden to myself.
Yeah, quality rather than quantity.
Yeah, more than anything, I think that if you just, it's like the great joy of being self-employed is that short, sharp bursts of work are the order of the day. And I like having a period to put out, say, 12 or 13 episodes and then not having to think about it for 6 months is quite nice. Whereas I imagine the other kind of model, which is to do something every week, can, certainly around a self-employed, ever-changing schedule, could become quite a bit of a burden, I imagine. So that was the way it came about.
Yeah. So why Honest Actors?
If I go all the way back to the start, one of the things that, like everybody, I think was a generational sickness, which is you see something you like and you decide you're going to do it yourself. So you go to a yoga class and the next thing you're going to start teaching yoga. So I discovered podcasts, and the next thing, the obvious move for me was to start my own podcast, And just at that moment in my career, I kind of felt like I wanted to hear actors being honest. I was at a point where I knew that a lot of people around me were posting stuff on social media that wasn't necessarily the full picture of what being an actor is, or what being self-employed in the creative industries is. It was a kind of self-serving promotional tool that edited out all of the less glamorous parts of that existence. And the very basic concept to begin with was, wouldn't it be great to hear? And at that point it was Judi Dench. Of course, it didn't happen, but wouldn't it be great to hear Judi Dench admit that between jobs she panicked about where the next job was coming from? I doubt she does. Maybe she does. I don't know. But that was kind of the thing, was actors are given lots of opportunities to talk about work. So whenever you get a job, someone will say, can you talk to the local paper? Or if you're in a big show, will you talk to the, national papers? Or will you go on this TV show or this podcast or whatever, talk about a movie? But very rarely do you hear people talking about the bits in between. And so the idea behind Honest Actors, when I was about being honest, was I didn't want the spin. I didn't want the kind of PR glossy version of the existence. I wanted people to sit down with me and say, yeah, you know what? I hate doing auditions. I find going on stage terrifying. I didn't work for 9 months after I got an Olivier, and it was the hardest 9 months of my life. All those things that have come up on the podcast since were exactly why it started and where the name came from. Originally, it was called In Anything at the Minute, which is a terrible name for a podcast. But it came out of that sense of, just that frustration of being out of work and somebody saying, so were you in anything at the minute? And actually being able to honestly reply instead of having to say, well, I'm just about to do this, meaning 3 months from now, or I'm waiting to hear about, even worse, which could be nothing, but able to turn around and say, actually, no, I'm not resting, because that's a terrible term. I'm not working, and this is how I feel at the moment. And it was kind of, I guess, part of also a bigger move in the industry towards acknowledging, in general terms, the poor mental health of performers, and that very little was being done about that. So it was kind of a part of it. I think it was surfing on several waves, to be honest, in terms of the podcast boom and the fact that people were starting to crave more honest discussions about mental health as much as anything.
But that question that you originally used as your title, you still finish off with that at the end of your podcast. And it's a question that when I've been interviewing actors, it's an easy one to finish with. So what are you doing next or something like that? But sometimes you see that look of terror in their eyes and you think, I shouldn't have asked that. I've lost them now. So it's a scary one to ask, isn't it?
Joanna Scanlon rephrased it as, do you mean am I currently under contract? Which I think is brilliant, because if you're under contract doesn't necessarily mean you're working. It just means that someone signed you on to work on something in 3 months' time.
Yeah.
But I think it's brilliant because even when I ask it now, we're so trained to, because it's a standard audition question as well. So, what have you done recently would be an opener in an audition. And we're so conditioned into, it's funny as well, no matter how many times I get asked that in an audition, I'm never prepared for it. And I think it's probably like it's certain questions in normal job interviews that you think I should have thought they were going to ask that.
Yeah.
And we're so conditioned into putting a real gloss on everything that even after chatting to actors, sometimes for well over 2 hours before I edit it, the very last thing I say, are you getting anything at the minute? And even if they've listened to every single episode in the show, they'll still say, well, I've just done the thing, and then I have to go, I'm sorry, the question is, are you in anything at the minute? And then they laugh usually. And I think that's what we're trying to move towards, is a time whenever, at least amongst ourselves, I've said this before, I think performers and people in self-employed generally have a responsibility to each other to be more honest about the full spectrum of what it is that we do on a day-to-day basis. Because certainly for people coming into the industry, they'd be forgiven for thinking they're the only people that go through these difficulties. That once you get to a certain point in the industry, you don't worry about work, you don't worry about your finances, you don't worry about your health, you don't, panic about jobs, or you don't, panic about your tax return or all those things. And of course, that's a fallacy that we've inflicted on each other over time. And so I guess that was another, reason for doing it, was to try and gradually unpick that to a point where you could turn up, an actor could say, how are you doing? And you wouldn't reply with, I'm really busy. You'd actually say, I'm okay, actually, been on holiday or whatever the normal things people talk about are. Because I think we are very work obsessed and, dare I say it, self-obsessed in the industry. And it's sometimes good to have a little check on that, a little reminder that there's more to life than acting. In spite of the fact that the podcast could be accused of being a navel-gazer's delight, it is, I think, certainly trying to be something else. It's trying to say, listen, the general message is there's more to life than acting, and we all tend to obsess over it, and anxiety that way lies. So that's kind of been the point of it.
There is an element of self-preservation in not admitting the full horror of what you're going through as well, isn't there? I mean,
yeah.
I remember interviewing a fairly well-known ex-soap actress who was fairly frank. I mean, she's in the tabloids all the time, she seems to be. Yeah. But she said she's gone months without work, and she really struggled, frightened of going out and meeting people and getting that question, even at parties and things like that.
Yeah, it's a terrifying prospect. And in terms of, it is something that, it's self-preservation. I think in a way we have to maintain that fallacy, because if you acknowledge the full picture, which includes the average income for an actor stands at something like £9,000, that 98% of us are out of work at any point in time, aside from the fact that you'd forgive anyone for telling us that we're crazy, it keeps us going, I think, sometimes, to believe that the people slightly above us have it easy. Yeah. Because if the people slightly above us have it just as hard, then I guess that makes it much more difficult. But my whole thing has been that even if you don't want to admit it publicly, even if you don't want to go on social media and say, I'm unemployed, the point is, if another actor asks you, you should at least be aware of the fact that maybe I shouldn't spin this. Maybe we should just all be a bit more honest. And ultimately, I think it would be really healthy if, even when you go to post, because I know a lot of actors will get a job and the first thing they'll do, because they're celebrating and they're in a moment of, relative delight, is they'll compose a self-congratulatory tweet, which they then back away from, rewrite into something that sounds more like they're talking about the joy of working with wonderful people. Yeah. And then they'll put it out there. And I think ultimately, most actors, most of their followers are other actors. and statistically most of those actors will be out of work. So I feel like there's been a culture growing, and it's a very American influence thing of unintentionally rubbing other people's nose in the myth of your own success, if you know what I mean, because that's the only thing we ever talk about isn't my life great? And it's a thing, it's across social media. It's not just actors. It's that thing, the Instagram life that doesn't really exist for anyone. And it's, psychologists have been saying for quite a while that it is, that there's a direct correlation. It's slightly more complex than, straightforward, but there's a direct correlation between social media usage and incidences of, poor mental health. And I think that kind of says it all about our generation. And sadly, it's become part of the industry as well. And it's I don't think we're particularly well equipped to deal with it in this industry. So I would rather we're a bit more aware of the stuff we put out in the world and the impact that it has on the other actors around us.
Talking of the joy of getting that work, there is another question that you commonly ask. I'm sure you know which one, about when you're happiest. Can you just explain that question and where it comes from?
Do you mean the one about an agent once told me?
Yes, yeah.
So I had this agent. It's funny because I recently did the very last interview of Series 3, and I revealed the name of the agent after many years. And it's a guy called Patrick Duncan, who was my very first agent in Belfast years ago, like 15 years ago, maybe 20 close on 20 years ago. And he said he was really good at, kind of, I suppose, lifting the curtain and explaining the things that went on, how it was from an agent's perspective, and kind of had an open door policy at the agency and all that. And his thing was, the only time in his experience that an actor was ever truly happy, in his interactions with them at least, was in the 5 minutes after they got a job. Because in the vast majority of cases, at that point, 5 minutes in, after the elation and the fist pumping and all that, would come self-doubt. And that from 5 minutes on, he would be basically psychologically managing his clients to get them to the point of opening night, because they would think, I doubt it was first choice for this, or I wonder how they offered it to before me, or I don't think I can do this, this is bigger than anything I've done before, or I'm probably a bit too young or too fat or too short or too tall or whatever it is. Like, all those things kick in, and imposter syndrome effectively, I think, is probably what you would call it. And so I've been asking that now since the start. And some people, like, the thing I end up with, do you recognize yourself in that? And if not, what happens to you 5 minutes in? And some people do say, the happiness lasts a lot longer. But most people have acknowledged that the fear, once that, it's probably something chemical, I'm sure somebody could explain it. But once that adrenaline rush dips, and it's effectively, you go into some kind of shock.
Yeah.
And, your soul starts to shiver. And, it's something I deal with a lot. And as over time, you just get better at burying it, because it's not helpful. But the question's very much, if there's a psychologist listening to the show, and I've spoken to a few that have, it's quite clear that the questions come from my own anxieties.
Yes.
So every question is basically an admission of some small part of my anxiety about the industry. So what's the longest you've gone without work is a way of making me feel better about the fact that I've gone long periods without work. And I think that's why it's got such a kind of people have a real strong emotional connection to it. And it's become people always describe it as a community. It's become this kind of sense of, it's almost like a virtual support group where we never meet and never speak to each other, but that everybody identifies with certain things that have come about. There's certain discussions that have been had, and Denise Goff said, you've created AA for actors. It says, it's all about identification. It's about being in a room full of people and realizing, oh, it's not just me.
Yes.
And so I guess all of those questions come from, to say that question about 5 minutes, is because that's how, when he said that to me, I thought, yeah, that's exactly how I feel, is the elation soon subsides, and then some kind of self-doubt kicks in, which, at some point you'll put behind you. But I think it's an interesting thing that certainly in the general population, I think people who go to theatre, for example, have this, I imagine, a broadly held belief that actors love the limelight, or that, my family will say to me, oh, but you love standing up and talking. Like, if there's a wedding, they'll ask me or my wife to go up and do a reading. And whenever we pull a face, they'll be like, but you're an actor, you love that. And the truth is, we actually don't.
No.
There's some part of us deep down that genuinely, it is the most terrified we'll ever be, and yet we keep on doing it. There's something else that drives us to do it. But I always find that contradiction quite interesting as well.
Yeah, interesting, sort of related to that. I was asking a few theatre directors how they coped with press nights, how they felt on press nights. And one of them, quite interesting, the theatre director who was based in Manchester at the time, he said he gets more nervous on the first day of rehearsals than he does on press nights, which I thought was a really interesting response.
Yeah, it's funny. There's an interesting thing. I assisted a director called Mark Lambert in Ireland a long time ago on Sheila Stevenson's Memory of Water a long time ago. And he said to me on the first day, I just started acting and I thought assistant directing might be an interesting way of, watching actors at work in a rehearsal room. And Mark's a really gifted actor. And he said, watch when they come in. They'll all put their handbags or their bags on the table. In front of them as a little wall.
Yes.
They'll all take out their vitamin B12 and their iron tablets and arrange them around them, to extend that wall horizontally. And, not everybody, but it's certainly true that on that first day, nobody wants to be the first person to have a line. Like the terror for the first person, the opening line is terrifying. And particularly if you don't know the other actors, you're always like, am I going to be the weak link?
Yeah.
And first days are terrifying. The first day you get up, if you don't get up on your feet in the first day, is terrifying. Getting on stage, oddly, I've never found terrifying as a professional actor. When I was younger, I used to get butterflies and stuff, but I've never found that terrifying. I've never found an audience frightening. I find the judgment of other actors soul-shatteringly terrifying. It's ridiculous, but I've never been about to go on stage thinking, oh no, but I certainly have been pretending to be on a phone 2 minutes round the corner from a rehearsal room, trying to kill every minute until 10 a.m. when we turn up, and just so I don't have to have some awkward conversations.
It's a really odd situation into that first rehearsal. Where do we start? What do I do that makes me look good rather than embarrasses me in front of everybody else? Yeah,
it's the classic. When you introduce yourself around a circle of people, you're so busy trying to remember your own name, you don't remember anyone else's. And it's first days of school. It's one of the things in terms of mental health that has a huge impact on actors, I think, is the constant looking for work, getting it, and then it disappearing again because 2 months later you start again. But equally, I think the thing is you go from first day of school to 4 weeks later. By the time you open the average show, you feel like you've been friends with the company for life. For some reason, there's something about that rehearsal process that creates a sense of proximity or sense of intimacy that you won't get, I don't think, in any other job in 4 weeks. But then 4 weeks later than that, if it's a regional 2-month contract, you're saying goodbye and you may never see those people again. And, and that's the difficult thing, is that not only the work stresses and the financial stresses, but that constantly, I found my soulmate and then bye-bye, get drunk. And then, as I said to someone the other day, you always start unemployment with a hangover. It's the worst way to start unemployment. But yeah, I think press nights are an interesting one that I've never even thought about it. I try not to, but first days of rehearsals, I get that. That's terrifying. Although I'd love if someone asked me to come in and join them in a first day of rehearsals quite soon, actually.
Yes.
In saying that, I think it's a fear I can probably get over.
Yeah. That answers your final usual question then. Your are you in anything at the minute question.
Yeah. No, I just finished the job. What? Yeah. No, I'm not. I'm absolutely mad keen to get back in the rehearsal room. I haven't done a play in 2016. I did Much Ado About Nothing in Theatre Clwyd and with Tamara Harvey, and I haven't done a play since, partly because we moved out of London, but partly because other things were happening and we were doing other jobs. But I think everybody does it. It's partly grass is greener if you're doing telly and stuff.
Yeah.
You want to be in a theatre rehearsal room, and then if you go into the National Theatre rehearsal, I'd say dressing rooms of the average night, they're all craving 3 days filming on their week off during the turnaround, and that's just grass is greener stuff. But for me, it's also, and I think this is fairly common amongst actors, there's nowhere quite like a rehearsal room. There's nowhere else in the industry where you're encouraged to make mistakes, and certainly on television and film, you cannot. There's too much at risk for you to start making mistakes on set just to try stuff out. And certainly if you're not the lead in something, it's never going to happen. It will not be encouraged. Whereas a rehearsal room, for me anyway, one of the things that I've learned over time is, having entered the industry thinking it was all about getting it right as quickly as possible, I've learned from working with really great actors that actually the rehearsal room is where you're encouraged to get it wrong again and again and again and again. And the greatest actors do so fearlessly and repeatedly. Yeah. And there's something about being out of that context for a long time and being in the other, which is get it right now.
Yeah.
And get it right quick, that actually you start thinking, I would love to be back in a lovely rehearsal room with some lovely people making a fool of myself repeatedly.
So to anybody who listens to all of the things that you and the people you've interviewed say about the trauma of being an actor, that's what makes it worth it. Is it that period between after you've got over the initial rehearsal and before the madness of dress rehearsal week? That's the bit that it's all for, is it?
I don't know. I go through periods where I say things and don't really believe them. I said not so long ago that I could take or leave the bit with the audience, and then as soon as I said it, it was a different interview, and I was coming home thinking, why did you say that? But I think there's something about the rehearsal room that's magic, and there is an audience in the rehearsal room, and that's what's lovely about it. But it's a different type of audience. In saying that, it would be worthless if it wasn't for the fact that you knew ultimately you were going to put it in front of an audience of the public, of people who'd paid and who ultimately were going to judge whether they came with that intention or not. They were going to leave and decide whether they liked it at the very least. And I find theatre, one of the things I used to say about film, and I think I still hold this to be true, is that I used to try and say to my friend, say who's an accountant, I'd try and explain if I had a bad day at work, how bad it felt. I'd say, imagine you were doing someone's accounts and you made a mistake, and it was quite a rookie mistake, but a mistake nonetheless, and that you couldn't go back and change it. That's how accounting worked. Once it was written in the ledger, that was it. And so that ledger, if anybody wanted to know if you were a good accountant, somebody could pull that out at random and look at that and go, he's a terrible accountant. And that's how a bad day on camera feels. Is imagine your worst day at work, and somebody who doesn't know you could access that worst day at work on the internet for free on YouTube and decide how good you are at your job. It's terrifying. Whereas at least with theatre, if you have a monumental mistake on stage, which very rarely happens, let's be honest, but if you make what you feel like is a mistake on stage, unless it's the last night of the run, you know you've got tomorrow. On film and television, you've never got tomorrow. You've got this take and perhaps one more. And that's the thing that I think is glorious about theatre, is even when you're out of that rehearsal room, it's not complete. And this is, these are, this is nothing new, but that's the fact that it's always incomplete, the fact that it's always in flux, and the fact that you can not only discover things that are better, but even if you discover things that are worse, at least you know tomorrow not to do them. And there's something lovely about that process. That's the only really word to use. There's something about the fact that it's an ongoing process, that it's a living, breathing thing. And without sounding all very kind of happy, clappy, actory about it, that to me that's the reason why you put yourself through all the other stuff, because that process is joyous. Even in its hardest moments, and the moments where, and every actor I think gets to this, where in a rehearsal room you think, I'm not going to get this. I don't have it in me, may pick the wrong person. And it could be 2.5 weeks in. And I think usually there is a kind of what's the opposite of a sweet spot? There's a sour spot about 2.5 weeks into rehearsal, where if you get any size of a role and any kind of huge responsibility, where I think you do start to go, this isn't as good as it should be at this point. And like that agent a long time ago, every director's job in some ways is to manage the psychological mood of a room full of actors through a process of 3 or 4 or 5 weeks. And there's something about, I think, once you've got through that, I don't know if I can do this, and you get to the point where you feel like, potentially at moments you feel like this is the greatest play that's ever been put on, that's the joy of it, is the kind of that the relationship with it is constantly evolving. And whereas with film, you do it, they shout, moving on, you move on to the next scene, and you won't be able to change it. You won't even know which take they'll use until you see the film, and you won't even know if it's going to be on your face or the back of your head. Yeah. And so there's something lovely about theatre. The fact that it's out of your control and in your control at the same time is glorious, and it's an actor's medium, and it always will be, regardless of how technology moves. There's something gloriously troglodyte about the acting process on stage. Like, it hasn't changed. There's no magic kind of green screen malarkey that can go on. It's you and the audience and your fellow actors, and I think that's the happy place is effectively what I'm trying to say.
I know the big difference between acting and something like accountancy or most other jobs, or even other artistic jobs like musician. A lot of people think they can do it because it's just standing up there and talking. Anybody can do that.
Just being a human being.
Yeah, particularly actors who, they're just being themselves, but being yourself on a stage is not a natural thing to do. It's not an easy thing to do. So is that a frustration that everybody thinks it's an easy job? Why are you always going on about all these problems when it's so easy?
I did this, an emerging actors roundtable with 7 actors who I picked from applications who were just like 1 or 2 years into the industry. And one of the questions I asked was, are there too many actors? And I was surprised that they all went, no, there's room for everybody. And I didn't know whether it was a generational thing, because I think that's one of the big changes in the past 10 years. There's been a kind of a sense that, anybody can be famous, and that one of the ways to do that is to be an actor, and being an actor is somehow easier than being a musician. Yeah. Because at least with a musical instrument, anybody can tell someone that you can't play that. You literally, there's technical things you cannot do. You cannot play the chord of F, and therefore there's only a certain amount of songs you can play. It's simple with music. I think acting is much more difficult because it is possible, and it does happen, that people have a gift for it. Yeah. And that they can, at 17, stand on stage at the Royal Court and do something extraordinary. And that, I think, is what terrifies people about acting as well, because it is almost alchemical. There are people who train for years and have been to the best schools, and you stand on stage with them and you think, really? Really? And that's just the nature of it. But then that's my subjectivity as well. But I think there are, if not too many actors, I think there are, oh God, it's hard. People thinking they can do it doesn't annoy me, because I am one of those people. Yeah. So I decided I was going to do it and came and did it. And that's as much as there is to that story. But I do feel like there's too much of a push towards exactly the things that I suppose the podcast was rallying against, which was fame as a way into acting. So getting enough followers on social media and getting some nice photographs, and then pushing as hard as you can push until somebody gives you, and usually it's not a play, right? Usually it's a part in a TV show or a film or something. Because there's, I think, not less technique, but different techniques in those forms, which are actually, people can fool themselves into thinking they've got more easily. But yeah, it's an odd thing. I don't know if it has changed. I'm sure every generation has its equivalent. But certainly to think that there are something like 60,000 actors on the Spotlight site, and there are, something like 120,000 actors, they reckon, in the UK, is an insane amount. And if you had any kind of industry, or if it wasn't something that people loved, if it was like, if it was drain busters, if it was going and unblocking people's, I'm sure there are people who do that and love it for various reasons, but if it was unblocking people's drains, I'm pretty much certain that, you'd lose 90% of those people at once, because it doesn't pay well. It's totally irregular. You can't commit to going to any of your friends' weddings or stag do's or hen do's. You can't go home for Christmas a lot of the time because you've got like 2 days off. Like, it's the worst working conditions, and in that kind of job, certainly in the creative industries, it is, I think, the hardest one. But because even like, say you were stage management, you're usually on a longer contract, or there are 52 weeks of the year contracts available in some venues. But I don't know, are there too many people doing it? It doesn't annoy me, because I think it's self-selecting. Like, I think anybody can say they're an actor, and they can go and, maybe go to a couple of commercials castings, and they might be lucky enough to get a commercial, or they might get a thing in a student. But I think it's highly unlikely that those people ever get to the top of the business. Yeah. And if they do, they don't last there very long. Like, as I've got older, I've started to realise, as a younger person, I thought there were a lot more untalented people. Like, I thought everybody everybody fluked it. And as I get older, I realise, when I work with people, actually, that the vast majority of people you work with are exceptional. And then, sometimes when you see people in things and you're not involved, they may not be exceptional in that role. And I'm sure, as somebody reviews a lot as well, you're familiar with this. Like, somebody can be terrible in one thing and fantastic in another.
Yeah.
That's just, and that can be down to them. It can be a script, a director. It could be the fact that they're more concerned with their tax bill. Like, there's loads of stuff that can prevent things from being brilliant. And I think people who who just decide of a Tuesday afternoon that they're going to be an actor unless they've got something to back it up. If someone said, knock the door down, but make sure you've got the talent to back it up, there's no point in knocking down the door of the industry and then being anything other than certainly worthy of hiring at the very least. So I don't think, long answer to that question, but I don't think those people get very far.
Yeah.
Because it's hard enough for the rest of us.
Yes.
So I think it's people sometimes take it up and give it up much more quickly than they anticipate, because I think people think it's easier than it is. Even the people who say, I know it's really hard, the amount of people you meet whenever you say you're an actor who say, I used to be an actor. If there are 120,000 actors in the UK, there must be 2 million ex-actors who say, casting directors, people in the industry as well, but even, you go to a hospital, you speak to a nurse, I used to do a bit of acting, and then it turns out they trained and they gave it 2 years.
Yeah.
And they gave up. And, one of the things I'm talking about this a lot, but it's really interesting the amount of people who give up a year after training. It'd be interesting to see statistically, but anecdotally, I certainly know of a lot of people and peers of a lot of people who trained who have got out of drama school 3 years and a lot of money, a lot of time, a lot of sweat. And within a year, because they haven't got to where they thought they were going to be, have walked away and joined the fire service or opened a cafe and just totally walked away from it. You think, what were you expecting? What did you think what industry was waiting for you with open arms? Like, thank God you finished training. we were waiting for someone like you. But the people who make it usually are the people who have not only the drive but the talent. And I don't think it's not the kind of thing you can fall accidentally. I accidentally became a successful actor. It doesn't happen.
No. So apart from the question about what work the actors have done, what other questions have produced that same reaction where you've got to break down some barriers before you get at the truth?
Some of my favourite moments are whenever I think the questions that are hardest and the questions that are hardest to get the honest answer to are, what's the longest you've gone without work? And there's usually a pause. And then I tend to qualify it and say, we don't count voiceovers or stuff like that because, it's like you go in for an hour and it's not enough to feel like you're working. So let's take it to say to more than 1 day's work or whatever. Yeah. And people really struggle, to be honest with that, because there is an inbuilt thing, which is we're all told that being busy generates work. So work generates work. And we're also, I think, we're trained into not admitting if we haven't been working because we don't want to not be in demand. And the really fascinating contradiction in this is that casting directors know we're not working 52 weeks of the year, otherwise they wouldn't be able to hire anyone.
Yeah.
And so casting directors make a list of actors for stuff, and any good casting director worth their salt will know if the actors who they like are available at any moment in time, because they'll constantly be contacting me. So they know, like, when I haven't been working, the casting directors who get me in know I'm not working. It's why they're getting me in for jobs, right? But it's, for some reason, actors find the question of what's the longest you've been without work incredibly difficult. And it's even those who have been in full flow, admitting, the struggles of, what they do and going to therapy to try and sort it out and all those things. How long have you been without work? Dry mouth kicks in. And then the other one is, have you ever thought about giving up? Because there's something, again, in admitting that if you have, that means the fallacy that, if you ever think about giving up, you should give up.
Yeah. Or
if you've thought about giving up, then you don't love it enough, or you're not committed enough, or you don't deserve to get anywhere. Like, there's something about that still has some currency, certainly amongst actors, and certainly amongst the actors I've spoken to, where those two questions do elicit a larger pause for thought than any of the others. And there's a lovely moment in episode 2, it's Tom Goodman Hill, where I ask him, have you ever considered giving up? And he says, I must have, which is a lovely kind of lovely admission without actually getting into it. And I think there's a couple of times when I've said to actors, asked them a question, and they said, you know what, of course I have, but I don't want to even think about it now. And there have been people who not refuse to answer questions, but say, listen, yes, of course, but I've been to therapy and I understand that I have to tell myself that and remain positive. So as a coping mechanism, can we not go there? so it's so funny because these are not difficult questions. You're not asking people anything complex. You just ask them to make an admission that the truth of what we all do is slightly more complex than what we might present. So those are the two.
I won't ask you to name favourite interviewees, that wouldn't be fair, but are there any favourite moments or favourite answers that you've had?
It's any favourite moments? Tons is the answer. The moments, the first moment when I thought this podcast is going to work was I interviewed Simon Darwin first, and he went out as episode 3 or 4, I think. And Simon was a friend of mine, and we'd done a show a long time before in Theatre 503, where we all were doing like 10-minute plays, and it was a mixed bag, let's say, in lots of ways. And Simon has a really good head and shoulders, and when I thought of people who I might interview, I thought Simon could be interesting. And while I knew I needed people like Tom Gibbon-Hill and Jessica Raine, because I knew they'd be interesting, but also because people would be able to go, oh, I know who they are. People may not necessarily have known who Simon was. And Simon and I'd had a chat, and I, the next day, flew to Ireland for a job, and wasn't but 2 minutes off the plane, I got a phone call from Simon Darwin saying, I'd just been thinking about what I said, and I'm not sure I should have said this. And that was the moment when I realised, oh, this is important, because these are stakes. The stakes are actually quite high.
Yeah.
And if I can convince everybody that I will not make them look silly, and that I will edit out anything where I felt like, it might compromise them, and they're in safe hands, then there's a context in which people can be honest, and it might encourage other people to be the same. And that's in terms of the general podcast narrative, that's one of my favorite moments, was like an actor panicked about having said too much. And I thought, right, if I can get these out public, it's not like they're whistleblowing tapes or anything, but there's something that's deeply emotionally resonant or that people are worried about, then without, I guess putting people out there without them not being ready or willing. But if I can get these out there, these will make something happen in the industry, and I think they did. But in terms of like actual answers, God, there's so many. There's a section in Denise Goff's, which everybody loves, where she talks about being in Siberia. There's now a theatre company, I think, called Siberian Lights, which have started out in the past 2 years. And on their website, it has a quote from the podcast. It says, "We're all in Siberia in our little tents. If we poked our heads out and chatted to each other, we could have a great time." And the idea of us all being in, self-enforced exile in these cold little tents, worrying about where the next paycheck's going to come from, and there's another tent beside us that we don't even know about. And that section, I think a lot of people were like instantly identified with. And then I guess Tom's is one of my favourites. I listened to Justine Mitchell's again the other day because she emailed me about something, and I thought I must listen to that, and I really enjoyed it. Series 2, Michaela Cole is totally different in her energy to everybody else I've interviewed, and I think it's a great one for that reason. Matthew Flynn, again, another person I work with when I did a show at the National years ago, and who people wouldn't know, is in Series 1, and does one of the most heartfelt sections where he talks about being a dad and being an actor and being at the school gates and being a London parent at school gates of a reasonably good school, but being an actor who's skint, and the things that kind of stirs up within someone in terms of anxieties. But all of those moments where people have bad anxieties, whether it being a parent, being an actor, or whether it be being older and being unemployed, are all, I think, certainly stand out for me. But my favourite, I think, retrospectively of all of them is John Rogan, who passed away about 2 years ago, and I only interviewed him because Justine Mitchell put me in touch with him, because I ask every interviewee afterwards, who do you think I should interview next? Who would you like to hear answer these same questions? And she said John Rogan. People always give a list as long as their arm, and she just said John Rogan. And so she contacted John, then I got in touch and we had a chat, went and visited him. And John Rogan, for people who don't know, broke his back falling down in the escalator, I think at King's Cross Station, but it was wet outside, and he was running down the escalator and he slipped and broke his back in his, I think, like 40s or 50s, but certainly maybe only 15 years before he died, and ended up then in a wheelchair, paralysed with limited use of his arms and no use of his legs. And his interview, as someone who at that point was still acting, I saw him do Someone Who'll Watch Over Me in the Southern Playhouse a long time ago. Still acting, still loving it. And as he said, and when he put it all in context, he said, as long as I've got my health, then I'm happy. there's more to life than acting, which in a weird way is kind of one of the big messages of the whole thing. Is if a guy at that age in a wheelchair can still enjoy going out to work, is still feeling anxious when he doesn't get work, but it can also put it all in context and say, do you know what, after everything I've been through, it's not actually that important. I think that's whenever it ceases to be navel gazing, and it actually, you kind of raise your eyes up again to the horizon and think, oh right, okay, let's see the world. It's a bit bigger than just acting. And yeah, so for me, John Rogan's kind of interview, and certainly the bit about putting acting in context, is probably the highlight.
Your own acting, you've covered at all levels: film, TV, theatre. You seem to, I mean, your IMDb looks quite impressive. You seem to have consistently had work coming in.
I don't know. There's a whole other honest conversation to be had about that, I think.
Well, that's the CV that people see from the outside. So does it not feel like that from your point of view?
This is one of those moments where I pause for too long. There's a website called ulsteractors.com, right? And the guy that runs it just basically A to Z actors from Northern Ireland, Ulster, right? And my agent hates it. I think it's hilarious because the last line is, in spite of, and I'm gonna give you the boast so I can then just, basically whip the everything from underneath it. In spite of an obvious talent in all mediums, Jonathan Harden has struggled to secure a decent train of work. That's the last line of my bio on that site. And I think, there's something about, if you believe your own kind of promotional materials, then there's something wrong. Yeah, I've been relatively lucky, I think, at times. Have I got friends who've worked more than me? Yes. Have I got friends who've worked less than me? Yes. Have I been able to pay all of my bills all of the time? No. Have I done jobs purely to pay the bills? Yes. My career's been a mixed bag, there's no question. And there have been bits that I never thought I'd achieve. Like the things that I've done, I never thought I'd get to. And equally, there are some things that I hoped I would have done by now, and that seemed totally out of reach. And I put it down to lots of things. Sometimes I put it down to the fact that I'm from Belfast. Sometimes I put it down to the fact that I started too late. I didn't train. I didn't do such and such a play. I turned down such and such a job. I wasn't available. On my lowest days, I say things like, if only I'd done that play in Northampton, things could have been so different, right? But that's, I have to just, reconcile myself with the fact that I have worked. Someone has decided to employ me, some people more than once, and I hope that they continue to do so. But I could definitely do with a decent train of work, as ulsteractors.com puts it. But, so could everyone else.
But haven't you been moving to the other side of the camera more recently?
Yes, I have a little bit, yeah, and it's a lot of fun, and I really enjoy it. And in a way, when I moved to London, I stopped directing theatre. I've been directing theatre in Belfast and used to run the Lyric Theatre Studio in Belfast, and gave it up because I decided no one in London would take me seriously if I introduced myself as an actor, director, producer. And I think I was right about that. But I think now that we've been there 10 years, my wife's a writer and an actor, and she wrote a script for me, and I directed it as a short film a couple of years ago, and then did another one that she wrote about a year ago. And it's been great as a creative outlet. Again, no money comes from this, and we've had to raise money for various means to make them, but it's been really nice to direct again and to work with actors in that way. And you learn a lot, but equally you also learn about how difficult other people's jobs are, which I think sometimes as an actor you teach yourself not to think about because you're so focused on your own little part of a project. And directing's hard. Directing a good short film is really hard. Yeah, really, really tough. But I don't want to say string to my bow. It's another thing to panic about. It's another career thread that could snap at any point. And if I'm honest, I probably should have spent the money and went and trained as a dentist or something. But, what can you do? Actor dentist is probably a much more sensible / career. But I chose actor / director again. But, there's obviously some kind of screw loose somewhere in me that every time I think about what I want to do next, it's always something that is arduous and creative and very badly paid. But like podcasting, for example.
Yes.
But, that's just probably something that's always going to be in me. And as much as I sometimes fantasize about a different version of me that would be happy, going back and doing a degree in software design, I also think being an actor has destroyed any possibility of me ever being able to work 9 to 5.
Yeah.
Because, I can do it for 4 weeks, but then I want to do the show. Why are we still in rehearsals, guys? Can we not take this in front of an audience now? So yeah, I mean, I don't know. It is what it is. It's been an interesting little side journey, but whether or not it goes anywhere is very much out of my hands.
So doing the podcast, it's a great opportunity. I know this is why I do it, to speak to people that you really admire and that you'd love to, you see them doing their work that you admire and you think, I'd love to be able to speak to that person. And this gives you the opportunity to do it. So who have you got coming up? You've got some great actors on the...
I've got some great ones. John Joe O'Neill is one of my... I hesitate to say this because he's the same age as me. He's kind of one of my heroes. And I think that would freak him out a bit. Because he's brilliant and because he came from the same part of the same city as me, and because he is the kind of actor that I, also hope to be, which is someone that occasionally you don't recognise.
Yes.
I've seen John Joe in shows where at the end of a show thinking, that guy was great, who was it? And then went, oh, it's John Joe. How did I not know that? He was but 15 feet from me. So John Joe's one of the highlights for me. Joanna Scanlon is in there, John Heffernan, Terry Minot, Brona Taggart, Emily Barrington. Tons of really good people. There's only 13, unfortunately, and this is the last series. So it was kind of tough because there are loads of people on my list now that I may never get round to, but equally I may very well just do one-off little episodes here and there. So I'm really happy with the list of actors I have for series 3. I got an email from Denise Goff the other day, so it looks like there may be another Denise Goff episode, which turns out it might as well be called the Denise Goff podcast at times, because I think for a lot of people that interview was the thing that defined the show, and certainly for a lot of actors, for Denise as well. I think she says there was a lot of goodwill for her, which is quite rare for an actor to feel the goodwill of other actors, willing them to succeed, because she was in People, Places and Things, just started at the time that the interview went out. So there might be another one with her as well. And as I say, if I find myself in a trailer in a different country in 3 years' time and have one of the people in front of me who I've always wanted to interview, then I can always put out a little special episode, I think. And that's kind of what I'm telling myself, is that even if it's finished, it's never finished. I can always come out of retirement for one last episode, as is traditional. But yeah, there are literally hundreds of people who'd be good on the podcast, thousands perhaps. And it's just a case that I have the same conversation again and again and again. And I felt like, do you know what? 39 of these is probably enough for now, for me, while I consider, are there any other questions I haven't asked that I'd like to start asking? And is there a different format for this type of interview that might be slightly more rewarding for me as someone who's been present for every interview at least 3 times? And this as well, as someone who sits and chats to someone, then sits and edits it, and then even though you probably don't want to, at some point we'll listen to it, from your podcast feed. And so this podcast has been a huge part of my life for 4 years, and I've listened to hundreds of hours of chats, and I'm at the point now where I think, what else can I do?
Yeah.
So that's my way of answering. That's who's on the show, and that's why I'm never doing it again. But yeah, so if I had the energy and people were interested, I would happily do it for the rest of the time, because in spite of the fact of my flippancy about saying I've had tons of these conversations and almost implying that I'm bored, oddly, every time I come out of one of them, I feel like, not that I'm walking on air, but I feel like ultimately I'm not the only dickhead. And there's a lovely solace in that. So walking into Kate Fleetwood's house, having gone in on the 29th of September 2017, pretty much thinking I'm going to give up acting, I don't even know why I'm doing these interviews anymore, and having decided that series 3 was going to be about me deciding the process of me giving up acting and what that was going to be, I came out of Kate Fleetwood's house determined that I was going to act for the rest of my life. And of course that only lasts so long, that you wind down again and then you think, I'm done. And then 3 days later I was in Adrian Lester's house interviewing him. And so there's something about, as long as they, I guess, have a positive impact on me, then there's always a possibility that if I find myself really low in 6 months' time and feel like I need to have a chat with someone, then I might as well record it and put it out, is what I'm saying. So yeah, they, in spite of everything, they still seem to have a really positive effect on me. And like I said at the start, that's what I designed them to do. And hopefully if they do that for me, then you hope that for other people as well, there's something of that in it. And I guess that's the point of it, really.
So there could yet be more members of the Honest Actors therapy group at some point.
Yeah, there could. The circle could enlarge. There's always a few more chairs stacked against the wall, and latecomers are welcome. So never say never. And I decided this was going to be the last series, but I've always said, like, if I find myself in a room with the right person, there's no possible way that I would not press record, because it's now how I think about everything. I think when you paint, you can't help but see things and think of paintings. When you do theatre, you can't help but, like, when you're making podcasts, for some reason, when you're in the shower, you think, oh, that would be a good idea for a podcast. Yeah. Or that would be a good question for that interview. And so it's going to take me a while to train myself out of that. And certainly while that process is ongoing, there are people on my hit list who shall remain nameless, who if I found them willing, within reach, then I would definitely do an interview.
The Honest Actors podcast is available for free on Apple Podcasts, Acast, Stitcher, Spotify, and other podcast directories and aggregators. For more information, see www.honestactors.com. You've been listening to a podcast from British Theatre Guide. For more information, please visit britishtheatreguide.info.